Thanks a lot. Thanks for inviting me here. It's been a great conference so far, very provocative. This is, so you're going to panic when I say this, this is a 7,000 word paper that I've cut down, so I'm actually going to try and finish early because I want people to love me, and I don't think I've ever gone to a paper and felt, hey, wait, where was the last 10 minutes? You know, you cheated me. So what I'm going to do is just off the cuff read 3 points that come from the 3,500 words I just cut. And so the first is the very conception of the Post-Anthropocene. So supposedly things are different now. Since geologists christened the possibility of a new geological era where we could see human damage done to the planet at a geological scale. A lot of what I'll be saying is about scale. We came to the realisation, oh my goodness, maybe we're Cartesian after all. Maybe we are a completely distinct form of life that is absolutely separate from ecology and capable of mastering, dominating and transforming nature. So that this one notion of the Anthropocene is that nature is now no longer nature, that we've transformed it. When I say we've always been post-Anthropocene, what I'm trying to say is there never was nature, this untransformed pre-human presence, and that the geological strategy of trying to find a time when there was nature has always been the strategy of a certain form of philosophical thinking. That's the first point. I'm going to hope that's going to make it clear. The second point I want to make is hopefully a little more rigorous, which is to ask about the relationship between the factical condition of philosophy, what factical conditions there were for philosophy to emerge, and by that I mean Western European philosophy, but I think it applies to other Eastern philosophical traditions as well. What's the relationship between the factical condition of philosophy and the transcendental condition of philosophy? So 20 words or fewer, I argue that factically, the fact that we're here now in a room doing philosophy is dependent upon the destructive conditions of industrialised technology that led to the Anthropocene. Factically, that's the case. We wouldn't be here if we hadn't messed up the planet, factically. Of course, transcendentally, that's not necessarily the case. One can imagine a different human history, and that's what I'm going to try and do in what I call the Anthropocene counterfactual. However, I then want to raise that question about why we think about such transcendental conditions. Third point, and this is where I hope what I'm about to say is relevant to the whole theme of liminality. If one does the Anthropocene, which I do, it's a little industry. It emerged about 3 years ago. There've been, I can gauge it from the fact that I was keynote speaker at a Derrida conference. Why? Because actually the 10 people they invited all didn't show up. So I was the, as they say in Australia, the ring-in. I was like I'm doing Derrida and the Anthropocene. And I was like, what is that? That was 3 years ago. Now that's like 20, I've done 20 conferences in the past 3 years. So it's supposedly a game changer. And I'm actually going to ask the question of why that difference, that geological difference, is seen to be the difference that makes a difference. There have been, there's a history of us knowing that we polluted the planet. I mean, we know we polluted the planet. And somehow this geological consecration of the Anthropocene has this, oh, blimey, you mean you're telling us we're ruining the planet? And I'm thinking, what form of stupidity allows the Anthropocene to have this fetishized difference? So it's this, suddenly geologists, and they are cool, I have to say, but why, you know, this is a little bit of a moment of resentment. Why are they so cool? And, you know, supposedly they found philosophers with their pants down. Like you think there's this thing called mind and the human. Well, we're telling you you're nothing more than a geological impact and you're not so wonderful after all. Okay, so that's the preamble. So what I want to do in this talk is pursue what I refer to as the Anthropocene counterfactual. By asking in what if anything the Anthropocene tells us. And my short answer to that question is the Anthropocene should tell us absolutely nothing. That everything that's disclosed, everything that we feel is a revelation in the Anthropocene, oh my goodness, you're telling me we're destructive, should have been something we should have known without the geologists telling us. So I want to explore what I refer to as the Anthropocene counterfactual. Let us imagine that all that is named by the Anthropocene, that is cataclysmic and irreversible human destruction of the planet, well, it's deemed to be irreversible if you're a geologist and you take irreversibility to be geological stratification. Of course, if you're operating at a bigger scale, the Earth will eventually disappear and that's reversible, it'll go. Oh my God, we've permanently scarred the planet. Well, that's true on one scale of permanence. On another scale of permanence, carbon's going to dissipate eventually, the planet will go, and hey presto, it'll be like we've never been and back to purity. But let's assume that we're operating at a geological scale. What would we lose or gain? And here's my crucial point as a sort of thought experiment. Would we act differently if we could live our time over? Okay, so now we know, oh my goodness, the whole trajectory of Western industrialized technology has led to this geological scar. If only we'd known that this was going to happen, we might have behaved differently. So the reason why I want to pose this counterfactual, and here this sentence is problematic in light of the 2 days of the conference, is what I say is, to test a key insight from phenomenology. So we've had definitions and non-definitions of phenomenology. Here's my definition, which seems to be, I thought it was self-evident, now it seems maybe a bit rogue. Here's what I think phenomenology is. That any event that occurs, such as the Anthropocene, should not be seen as external or accidental. That if something is possible, then it should not be deemed to be inessential, but should alert us to what it is in the essence that allows for such a possibility. I take this to be good old-fashioned Husserl. If it's possible to have the natural attitude, if it's possible to objectify the world, that should tell us something about subjectivity and what it is to have a world. If it's possible to be inauthentic, this should tell us something about subjectivity. But it's also, obviously, Derrida, that the condition for the possibility of the accident is what makes the essence possible. This is not to confuse a possibility with a necessity. It's not to confuse a possibility with a necessity. That is, it's possible that what we call the Anthropocene might not have occurred. Let's just imagine that we didn't evolve as destructive of the planet. But the fact that it occurred should make us inquire about what it is about life such that it is able to generate a species capable of destroying all life. So I want to say that we can imagine a non-Anthropocene or even a post-Anthropocene human. Okay, now that we know what we've become, can we imagine that we might have evolved differently? Why did human life as it is actualise the capacity to be milieu destructive? How might we have been otherwise? How might we have been otherwise? And then the question, does that question even make sense? So what I mean by that is this. Let's imagine that we could have been non-planetarily destructive. Let's imagine that. Is that one of those stupid analytic philosophy questions where you're imagining something, like let's imagine what it's like not to have a body, right? Is that just like, that just shows the stupidity of a certain form of philosophy. So I'm wondering if it's that sort of question, is asking what it's like for us to have not evolved destructively just something that only someone who's a stupid pretend philosopher needs to get out more, Okay, so here's whether that question even makes sense. So we can readily admit, I think, that extinction is extrinsic to life. Life emerges from catastrophic events. and that human life emerges not only after the mass extinction of non-human living species, but also emerges in what some people think is species bifurcation. So there's another possible world where the Neanderthals won out, even if there was, as people are saying, a little bit of crossbreeding in the beginning. So extinction is the way of the world and of life. But supposedly, the Anthropocene is different. It's a difference in degree, this is my Deleuze point, it's a difference in degree that then becomes a difference in kind. So what happens is that the rate of extinction isn't just adding one more loss of species, but shifts what it is to be a species. For hundreds of years, we've read the fossil record and noted the extinction of many species. But if the Anthropocene is true, humans will have become extinct and not just left a fossil record here and there, but had an impact at a different degree, geological impact. And then the claim is also that other species have made things go extinct, right? But humans are the only ones that will look at that capacity and so stare it down and say, yes, we did it, we can see ourselves doing it, and let's just keep doing it. So let's entertain the counterfactual. Counterfactual 1. Humans came into being, that is, in their species being, but did not develop technology, and here obviously the word techne for someone like me is highly, I don't think there is anything outside techne, just to put my cards on the table. But let's imagine that humans came into being, somehow there was no techne, did not develop technology to the point where the geological impact of the Anthropocene took place. So you could still have humans and techne, as in consciousness, temporal retention, communication, inscripting systems, but not to the point where this geological impact would have occurred. Some evidence of what such a humanity might look like appears to be offered in societies that have not employed the intensive industrialised agriculture that alters the Earth's biomass. So one of my research interests, is Indigenous Australian culture, and let's say that had been the way of all humans, right? There's transformation of the planet, but there's not geological transformation of the planet. So this is why the Anthropocene is become a fetishised difference. These people do transform nature, so there's still no nature, pure nature. But it's a lesser violence, less destructive. So not embarking on that route of industrialised agriculture avoids intensive resource depletion and carbon emissions. So it's possible, logically at least, it's possible materially that we could have had a human world, that did not have this geologically scarring effect. It's also possible logically, and here's the problem of thinking about logical conditions of possibility, that we might have had a world, and here I'm genuinely trying to think, is it possible? We might have had a world of industrialised agriculture and production that was not dependent on fossil fuels and finite resources. I mean, what if the ancient Greeks had discovered solar? Just saying, I mean, I'm talking about logical possibility. Or if the material composition of the planet was such that you could have had fossil fuels and that they didn't destroy the atmosphere and the ecosystem. Now, here's my question. So it's possible. Here, if such a world were possible, is it the world we would choose? Right, here and now. So I've got two counterfactuals, so I'm trying to explore this. One of the things that I hadn't considered until Naomi Klein's climate change book came out, I think five or maybe a week ago. It was in the pipeline. Her scenario is a third one. Her scenario is that climate change is, if you like, a felix culpa. That yes, it's destructive, but ultimately it's destructive of capitalism, And the world we'll end up with is better than one. Like, if capitalism hadn't been climate destructive, it would have just coasted along and kept chewing up humans. But the fact that capitalism's been so environmentally destructive means that, okay, now it's not just humans that are being chewed up, but the planet. And so even the capitalists are going to say, oh, okay, this is a game changer. So she's got a scenario where it's a Felix culpa. That you wouldn't. Her argument is no, you wouldn't. Well, the implication of her argument is no, you choose it because now we're going to end up with this socialist utopia where green policies and climate-friendly policies are going to also be social justice policies. The implication of where I'm going is to put a minus sign in front of that, sadly. Anyway, counterfactual number 1. Humanity could have developed differently, remaining more nomadic and with a sense of history more attuned to the broader rhythms of the earth beyond that of the human agricultural year and its seasons. So here's my claim that makes me sound like a climate change denialist. I argue that there has always been climate change, that there are cultures like Australian Aboriginal culture that has a sense of climate change operating over thousands of years. They're aware that of desertification as a long-term process. They don't have the industrial agriculture year of this is harvest season, this is winter, this is summer. Their natural temporality includes climate change. But it's a sense of climate change beyond anthropogenic climate change. So rather than see climate change on that scenario as an event that befalls a stable nature, it's not that humans have destroyed this stable nature. We should reverse that and see that stabilised nature is the product of industrialised technology and what got us there and the desire for a stable or unchanging climate, the desire for an unchanging climate, that you could eat broccoli all year round, if you like, is what got us into this mess. So what I'm arguing is that there's no such thing as natural stability. In fact, it's the notion of nature, this stable, timeless, seasonal, renewing whole that is a product of industrialised technology, and that there might have been other human cultures that developed with a sense of climate change, that the earth is volatile, that you have to pay attention to it, that you, if you want to live, you've got to burn back and deal with nature's volatility. So what I want to argue is that climate change in the Anthropocene, in the anthropogenic sense, is the consequence of thinking of nature as an unchanging, standing reserve. So possibility 1 is that humans did not develop that industrialised attitude towards nature. They have a technology, they are changing the planet, but they're living with the planet's volatility to change. So I would say that one of the things that we would want to imagine in this counterfactual number 1 is that we didn't invent nature in Timothy Morton's sense, though the thing that we're mourning now is what got us into this mess. So if that's possibility 1, you have to think of all the things that you don't have, including liberal systems of liberal democracy, which maybe you won't need because you don't have industrialised violence at the same time, but I'll go into that later. Okay, counterfactual number 2 is the sort of more properly counterfactual, is to imagine that the material composition of the world, the earth, might have been otherwise. I mean, that's just empty philosophy, I think, particularly with the talks we've had on home and home. You know, like, what would it be to imagine that we weren't born on this planet that was one of finite resources, and that exactly the same technological industrial complex developed, but didn't have the catastrophic effects that it has. So, first scenario, humans evolved differently. If we entertain the first scenario, how would what we have come to know as humanism, post-humanism, history and man, using that word non-gender neutrally, be different? One possibility is there would be no such thing as the human. Why? Because the human, Husserl's work on the emergence of the European sciences shows, relies upon a universalizing global imperative. I imagine myself here and now as seeing the world as it would be for any human whatever, which relies upon a certain scientific imagination, that abandons localism and imagines the here and now as being not simply present for me, but present for any subject whatever. We might have to think seriously, and here's where I'm arguing about the conditions for the emergence of philosophy, and all the Husserlian work on the emergence of philosophy in the Athenian state, which of course relied upon slave labour and the conditions of leisured thinking that allowed for the emergence of abstraction, logic and universalism. Civilizations of industrial complexity are not simply knowledge events, they're not simply knowledge events, but rely on the harnessing of human power. That is, it's the condition for the emergence of the reflective policy that relied directly on enslaving other humans. The Athenian city-state was a slave state. And I want to argue, not accidentally. Unless you consider the accident to be, well, it just so happens that our lousy earth didn't have enough Garden of Eden abundance that we had to enslave other humans in order to have the leisure conditions for philosophy. This enslavement of other humans, and this is drawing on Jared Diamond's work, you can only enslave other humans if the earth offers sufficient resources for you to have a sedentary, non-nomadic polity. So you have to have a fertile ground that enables you to produce excessive metabolic resources that allow you then to have a certain enslavement of other humans. You enslave other humans only with, Jared Diamond uses the word kleptocracy. You have to have some people that steal enough of the earth's energy to develop religion or priesthood. It sounds sort of Nietzschean at a certain point. But here's my... it's only a certain material condition that allows non-nomadic culture to emerge. So there's a sort of feedback loop between you have to have the earth's resources, have to be rich enough for you to develop a complex technology that enables you to enslave other humans. So human slavery is a consequence of enslaving the earth. And what's more, human slavery lessens, this is Debesh Chakrabarty's work, human slavery lessens the more you enslave the earth. So as technology increases, my claim is that things like feminism and the anti-abolition movement don't emerge just because we're feeling more benevolent, but because we can afford to feel more benevolent. So women are liberated from domestic labour because we've got industrial technologies that allow you to come home and put dinner in the microwave. Similarly, the anti-abolition movement comes about in the 18th century at the same time as you're getting industrialised technology. Why? Well, maybe I don't feel I have to enslave other humans if suddenly technology is developing, you have factories and efficiency. Of course, that leads to different forms of enslavement, but I guess that's my point. That the relationship between technology, archival inscription and enslavement are symbiotic. That is, you need enslavement to have human writing, but you need writing to have human enslavement. That is, someone accepts an enslavement in the broadest sense. Someone accepts servitude only with complex archival inscription and material memory systems. So only with complex archival inscription and material memory systems such as writing, in the broader sense, could we have both the expansion of empire and the technological history that generates global hyperconsumption. So here's our counterfactual. We might say that it would be well worth sacrificing Euclid, Newton, Shakespeare, Apollinaire, Baudelaire, if that would be a sacrifice, to avoid embarking on the path to globalism and universal humanism. We'd lose human rights because we wouldn't have the universal human, but then we might not require them as much. So this is not to say that in this pre-techno globalised world there would not be human-on-human violence, but there would not be the industrialised violence of genocide and mass slaughter in warfare that's enabled by inscriptive systems, global technology and institutionalised violence. So it's only with the appropriation of surplus labour that a culture can develop the symbolic systems required for the organised sacrifice and subjection that marks religion and cultural sublimation, and that in turn enable collective investments in everything from the human in its universal right sense, but also in possibilities of mass warfare. So, if globalism has been one of the crucial conditions for a sense of the universally human. That's my claim. Globalism, in its capitalist, technological, industrialised, agricultural form, has been one of the crucial material conditions for the sense of the universally human. That is, you have no United Nations without the Anthropocene. Not that we think the United Nations is necessarily the best thing on the planet. It's also the case that the ethical demand of the universally human seems both imperative in a violent cosmos at the same time as it emerges from a violent cosmos. So things we'd have to sacrifice if we didn't go down the Anthropocene path. Probably human rights, universal suffrage, civil rights, women's rights, feminism, ecofeminism, precisely because these are effects or emerge from a universalism and a rationalised cosmos. So the non-global, non-industrial, non-techno-scientific world would be one counter-Anthropocene scenario. Such a possibility, I want to suggest, poses this very inconvenient truth. What we know narrowly as, and I say feminism, liberalism, democracy, committed to all these things, relies on the hyperconsumption mode of globalism. In its enlightened liberal form, feminism, liberalism, globalism, human rights, requires at least initially, a reading elite liberated from domestic labour, capable of thinking about the freedom of thought and reason, and blessed with what John Rawls has called favourable conditions of personhood. So John Rawls' favourable conditions, where I'm capable of imagining myself as if I were any subject or whatever. And drawing on Tim Mulgan's work, I want to say that those favourable conditions, materially at least, could only have been favourable for a few at a certain point in human history, around the time of abolition, around the time of industrialised technology. So this thought of the counter-Anthropocene that did not arrive at rights, universalism, and favourable conditions lends what I think is more weight to Walter Benjamin's claim that every document of civilisation is a document of barbarism. This is not just to say that string quartets are written and appreciated in the same world as mass slaughter. It's not just that they contingently happen to be together. Rather, that some violent subjection of humans for the sake of generating surplus production and energy is required to release the time and space of the history of the Enlightenment. So that's my thesis. Some violent subjection of humans for the sake of generating surplus production and energy is required to release the time and space of the history of Enlightenment. Philosophy, rights, the constitution of a private self with a definitive personhood, sexuality and fulfilling life trajectory are not merely contingently placed alongside planetary and human violence. So in our planet, with our material conditions, those two things have not just been contingently related, but because of the material composition of our planet, are essentially related. We lived on a planet with limited resources. Dipesh Chakrabarty has argued that had humans not embarked upon the intense depletion of planetary resources, so had we not screwed up the planet, human slavery would have been worse. Quite crudely, as I suggested before, we can locate abolition and suffrage movements at the same time that industrialised economies were able to extract more planetary energy with less hold on human energy. So I see this, I guess, as a bad economist, as a zero-sum game. You either enslave humans or you enslave the planet. In this material Earth. Maybe. This counterfactual brings us not so much to another possible world without humanism and without a single history of human enlightenment and private sexuality, but rather to a threshold. So by arguing for this contamination, I'm saying that everything that we hold dear, including phenomenology and radical thought, is contaminated with the very history of that which we want to exclude, which is not just environmental contamination, but barbarism, human-on-human barbarism. So it's not to then say, oh my goodness, the whole thing's corrupt, therefore I fall on my sword or nail myself to a cross or whatever. But that it brings us to a threshold. That is what is the cost of thinking, what is the cost of thinking philosophically? It is possible to imagine a counter-history of minimal impact on the planet that might still allow for many of the things we know to be human, including inscription, morality, language and technology. And again, without fetishizing Indigenous Australian culture, I think there's an example of an archival technology that didn't have geological impact. However, it did have planetary impact, and it did have human-on-human impact. These are not non-violent cultures. It's possible to think that humans could never have, as it were, progressed without some planetary damage or alteration, but that such progress would not have developed to quite such a suicidal and ecocidal pitch. So what I'm trying to do is de-fetishize the Anthropocene as geological impact as being the game changer, that we've always had planetary impact. And not, I mean, what's the species that doesn't have impact on the planet? Humans are only fetishized as having planetary impact if you're a geologist reading a certain form of stratification. So counterfactual one is to have us ask ourselves what we would save. And for example, even if we consider that it's already game over, would we suddenly, and clearly not, because most of us took buses or cars to get here, would we start saying, oh my goodness, the Anthropocene, whereas destroying the planet, and I do know actually some academics who now refuse to fly to any conferences whatsoever because they're putting their money where their mouth is, but then you're at a threshold degree. Do you refuse to drive? And what 0 degree of sustainability do you say, well, I accept this degree of philosophical guilt, but not this much. I'm not getting on an aeroplane. I mean, Lucira Garay doesn't fly, for example, but for other crazy reasons. But these are. I mean, I think the one thing we have from phenomenology, these are differences of degree, and the essence of something is its trajectory, and how far along that trajectory do we want to go? Okay, so let's explore the second counterfactual and ask if we could have these reparative effects of globalism. I'm just assuming that globalism and humanism are good things, and that's a dangerous assumption. That let's say we have. I'm assuming that we like rules as favourable conditions. That would be another argument whether you'd want to argue for that value of personhood. But just for the purposes of argument, that we like a world in which there's recognition of other persons. So rules as favourable conditions. So let's explore the second counterfactual and ask if we could have these reparative effects of globalism and humanism without damage to the planet and without the violent extraction of human resources. So this other counterfactual is, would it be possible, like is this scenario that I'm describing really that necessary? What if we could do it without destroying the planet and other humans? I mean, it's worth asking. We would need to imagine another material Earth. Perhaps our planet could have been such that rather than fossil fuels which are limited, and rather than fossil fuels which are limited and destroy the atmosphere, there was some other stuff that was renewable, didn't destroy the atmosphere. Solar. What if the ancient Greeks had discovered a different renewable and non-polluting energy? We might imagine that rather than relying upon slavery to generate the otium or leisure time required for philosophical reflection, the ancient Greeks had found a resource that was non-violent and yet still allowed for the thought of humanity to be generated. Is such a world logically possible? That's I think the big question. But so this is where I now start to talk about the difference between the factical conditions of philosophy and the transcendental conditions of philosophy. I don't think it's possible to argue that philosophy doesn't have a factical condition in human and planetary violence. So if someone wants to challenge that, they can. I look back at our if we call ourselves philosophers, which I don't, but for the purposes I'm here today, so I guess I'm like, that our factical history is one that's bound up with human on human and planetary violence. And that it requires quite a exercise of the imagination to imagine a different counterfactual in that sense, whether philosophy, rights, phenomenology, justice, the otherness of the other, the thought of the otherness of the other could have emerged without that violent history. So that's the factical condition of philosophy. Of course, then one could say that that may be true in fact, but not true in essence or transcendentally. So this is where I want us to think, and I'm trying to imagine what it would be for philosophy not to have had that history, whether there could be something like, what do we call it, pure thought, thinking as such, the thought of time in its pure state. I'm trying to list my Continental, philosophy to come, justice to come, that may have had that factical condition, but could be imagined independent of that history. And here is where I'm going to conclude by raising the thought of someone like Quentin Meillassoux, who says, well, this seems to me to be the counterfactual philosopher par excellence. We do have this world in which there's material causality, and in which if we take our material Earth and our material planet, yes, it is the case that philosophy is inevitably bound up with planetary human-on-human violence. However, that does not stop us imagining or thinking outside those material conditions. And it's true that if one accepts something like logical possibility, this is where I go back to the beginning, if one accepts that there is something like logical possibility, it does make sense to ask what would philosophy be like that was not bound up with that history. So I think philosophy, if it is anything at all, and it's probably not, but let's imagine that it still is something, is to refute someone who's arguing for a factical connection as a logical and transcendental connection. That it's true that philosophy is bound up in fact with slavery. It's obvious that philosophy is not logically bound up with slavery. Like, we could be philosophers here and now, and there's no logical relation. There's possibly no transcendental relation. In fact, we can imagine this as such, thought as such. Here's my conclusion. That question itself, imagining a thinking that would not be bound up with its factical conditions, as it were, a thinking that would be somehow radically futural, imagining a thought that's not bound up with its conditions of emergence, is symptomatic of the logic of the Anthropocene. So I'm trying to fold it back in and say it's not just that we transcendental counterfactual logic people happen to have emerged with the Anthropocene, but that there's a certain conception of the transcendental or the logic is bound up with the Anthropocene. Here's the conclusion. The idea of a life that could develop to its utmost potentiality or purity, like that you could have something like pure life, pure thinking, without incurring debt or death to itself, is both what drives technological industrial investment. Oh, the more we develop clean tech, you can have clean technologies, or you could have pure thinking. I hate to say it because I really like Naomi Klein. Climate change is going to end up. We're going to end up with this utopia in which you have social justice and climate justice. Without, ultimately, it's a win-win. But this notion generates the delusional idea of a life without expense, loss, or misprision. It's the notion of generating more in the final instance than one initially takes. It's the dream of a pure ecology. So this is why I sort of, against my vegan sensibilities, quite liked the whole idea of the lesser violence of a certain deer. You can be a vegan, but don't think that it's a calculation of more or less. It's a threshold. The Anthropocene is a threshold. And when I'm, someone who's hunting deer and someone who's buying their vegan food from Trader Joe's, until you look into it, who knows, I think I know, but probably not. So the dream of a pure ecology in which everything serves to maximise everything else and in which there is no cost, it's this logic, a certain logic, the logic of logic, if you like, the logic of the pure counterfactual, which I think is, from Rawls onwards, like imagine this world of favourable conditions. At what cost? And then it was, well, factically it has this cost, but it needn't. I think that's the problem. The whole notion of the pure counterfactual, if that makes sense. The dream of a pure ecology in which everything serves to maximise everything else, in which there's no cost. It's this logic, the logic of logic, the pure counterfactual, or pure techne without physis, or pure physness without techne, that marks all that has stood for humanism. That's like humanism bad, but not human. I've got good human. Post-humanism and a certain dream of history and post-humanism. Where does this leave us? So that's obviously my concluding part. Are we just saying that life is intertwined with death, that all ethical relations to others also negotiate violence, and that humanism, feminism, liberalism is a grubby queer business that can do so much for only so few? If that's what we're saying, which I'm not, hopefully, then we would be keeping the counter-Anthropocene ideal in place. Yes, the pure world is desirable, but never fully achievable. I'm arguing, I hope, for something stronger that has implications for how we think about the Anthropocene. All our talk of mitigation, stability, maintains a notion of stabilised nature, a nature that would, if we hadn't done too much harm to it, be there for us and cyclically compatible with renewal. It does not, but this is what the Anthropocene occludes. There never was that nature. We should not think at precisely the point at which we posit a geological impact of a certain readable sort that we shouldn't be thinking that had we known this, we would have or could have acted otherwise. In a way that was essentially non-contaminating. Or put another way, the Anthropocene, what we have now, is actually a counter-Anthropocene. It's occurred and we're thinking, how can we erase it? It's like the Anthropocene is just legislated geoengineering. Like, how could we make it such that we never existed? As though that's something new, but that's exactly what industrialized agriculture is. You could just eat and consume the world all year round as though there's no humans eating and consuming. We now look at the geological scar and remark to ourselves, as though something has finally changed. My goodness, who would have thought that centuries of slavery, violence, kleptocracy, plundering, and then the liberation of some humans at the expense of others, who would have thought that this was destructive of the planet? Right? So it's like suddenly that insight occurred to us in 2002. That's only for post-industrialized humans. The idea that you're consuming and not destroying is so the dream of ecology is the anthropogenic climate change dream par excellence. Who could possibly have imagined that our species was destructive of its milieu until we got the definitive geological record? Final paragraph. We are thinking of the Anthropocene as exceptional. I mean, you guys aren't, but, you know, the milieu I work is like, what is the Anthropocene? It's like, we are thinking of the Anthropocene as exceptional, as a volatility or destabilisation of nature that has been caused accidentally by us. A sort of, oops, we went too far. What we know about the... So we are arguing that it's exceptional, right? That it's accidental. But what we know about the state of exception from Benjamin to Agamben and onwards is that if the normal can be suspended, like, oh my goodness, we've destroyed the planet, then this is because what was there as the exception was always there as a potential. There was nothing proper about humans and their relation to ecology. This is not exceptional. This loss of nature, this exceptional volatility, oh my goodness, nature has become volatile. It's uncontrollable. That's the way most humans have always lived. You know, it's like Hurricane Sandy is the first volatile human event that destroyed, oh my goodness, you know, climate change. Now we're being disturbed. No, humans have always been disturbed, except for a very brief moment in their history where they felt that they weren't. Nature appears now to be changing on us. It's refusing to be stable. That is not a result of anthropogenic climate change. That's what nature is. I mean, it's the condition. So it's the condition from which what we know as the Anthropocene manufactured a stable nature. The Anthropocene manufactured a stable nature. Volatility is the way of the world, not something caused by humans. What we now call climate change is the re-emergence of what made climate possible. Climate, you know, what we think of as climate, was manufactured from climate change. Climate change is there in the beginning. Climate stability is what was manufactured. What we're seeing is the return of the repressed. So the event of the Anthropocene is exceptional, but not by being extrinsic to what we have come to refer to as nature or humanity. If now we are responding to planetary destruction with surprise and wondering how we might engineer a future that would not cost the Earth, then we're just repeating the whole Anthropocene era. It's hardly an event. I want to say it's a non-event. Nothing happening here, move on. It's the continuation of man as the being who believes that he can finally be different and transform himself to the point where he makes no difference. I want to say that it's the very dream of a certain pure ecology that has always defined man in his essence, which is to say man in his trajectory that is ecologically bound up with violence and depletion. Thank you.